When it comes to lead seams, there's a few different options you guys can do. We want to show you guys what that variation is, and we're going to show you the way that we eliminate the lead seam completely with templating and gauges and different options to give you guys no failed seams. Typically, everybody has several different questions when it comes to a lead seam. Lead seams are found on a quarter panel, sometimes in the tail of the car, in rocker areas. It depends on what era the car is and what manufacturer. If you leave the lead in, a lot of times there is rust under that old lead. Not always, but we have seen it quite a bit. I've also seen factory seams that had holes 3/4 of an inch big on a Tri-5 Chevy that's just what the factory left. Those areas, as these cars flex, become problematic because it could crack. For example, the Tri-5 that I'm referring to, it did have a crack and it was in the lead. So just because it has lead, yeah, it's a little bit stronger, but you're still using a filler of some sort. You're not having one nice uniform sheet metal panel. And there's, I would say, tiers to how crazy do you want to get with the lead seam. I prefer to remove the lead seam. Doesn't matter if you are melting the lead out, but as a bare minimum, remove the lead, because a lot of times that lead will either contaminate or have a problem, or it's already got rust behind it. Eliminate it, find out what's behind it. Now what you're going to see is you're going to see your quarter panel and your roof seam as our example today. Now unfortunately we're putting aftermarket quarter panels on and it didn't fit good to begin with, so we've already removed that area. That's why you see the black inner panel behind it. But if you were to see what you have under your lead, you have a lap joint where they are lapping the two together and they are plug welding, spot welding with a machine usually, to hold those two panels together. But the problem is actually at the edge of the sheet metal. So if this quarter is laying over the roof, that sharp edge that goes around is always there. It's always there under the lead. And what are the options that if you're not going to make a replacement panel? You can use like a kitty hair body filler. It has a fiberglass reinforced, like the FiberTech would be something that we had used in the past and had decent results. But the number one thing is, even if you're going to do that, I would recommend welding the entire seam. So that sharp lip, as panels expand and contract and you have an area with filler on it, again, doesn't matter if it's lead or body filler or kitty hair, that area as it expands and contracts, that sharp edge is what is going to make that filler pop and crack. I have seen it on several cars, and a lot of times up near the window where the car is flexing, depends if it's a unibody car like this one or a frame car, sometimes you'll have a problem, sometimes you won't at all. But I've seen it and they crack. But if you go through there and actually weld up that edge and then just smooth out the weld, you have a lot better of a chance not having a crack in your lead seam. But in our case today, we cut the whole lead seam out. Now, how do you make an accurate panel? You could use this video in relation to if you're going to chop your vehicle, if you're going to remove a lead seam. There's several different things that are going to be in this video about how to take a good pattern, how to make a template and accurately make a shape that is flowing with the car, whether it be factory or whether you're going to make modifications. We have a lot of modifications that we're making to this 69 Fastback, and we want to show you guys a few different options to make a very nice replacement panel. Let's address a couple things here. Everything on this car that we've done is a lot of aftermarket parts. And when it comes to these aftermarket parts, we've said it time and time again, they all need modifying somewhere, some way. These are all screwed in right now with sheet metal screws and Clecos. We started rebuilding the 69 Mustang a while ago. It's taken a lot of aftermarket parts. We have aftermarket quarters, doors, fenders, hood, trunk, floor pan, and frame rails that all went into this car. And we've done Detroit Speed mini tubs on this car and section frame rails. The number one thing that I'll tell you is that when you're fitting all of these panels, make sure that you screw everything together before you start welding on any one panel. Make sure that everything flows side to side, because what we wanted to make sure here is that this panel is in alignment with the roof and it has a good flow with the shape. We are using sheet metal screws and Clecos. Clecos are used, you push them in, they depress in the center, and when it comes back out, the fingers will spread apart and hold the panel in place. So in this case, we have a quarter panel that we have to get pushed in because it just doesn't sit in there as nice as we would like. Now that we have this rolling through nicely, we're going to start our paper patterning. Paper patterning, I feel like, is crucial because if you're trying to make a shape from scratch, the paper is going to tell you everything that you want to know about where you're going to shrink or stretch metal. And I'm new to metal shaping, so I'm going to give it to you in the way that I understand it from several different people that I have learned from. If you think about metal, you can only do so many things to sheet metal. You can shrink it, stretch it, bend it, cut it, and weld it. And out of those few options, you can narrow it down to really easy step-by-step things in paper to actually be able to accurately shape that panel. So what we're going to do, we took a piece of paper and we're going to be using magnets. As we put these magnets down, you want to use a paper. Now this paper I just got, I would like to have something that's a little bit thinner grade. You want something that's going to just fall over the panel so you can see what shape you have. Now notice you have these wrinkles in areas where things don't want to flow, but if we put a magnet here and we pull it over the roof, everywhere that this is loose, we are going to have to fold it in. And if we fold that in on itself, that's going to signify a shrink. It's going to tell us exactly where we need to make those shrinks, so that way this panel will lay in, flowing from a smaller radius to a larger one where it goes up into the roof seam. If you think about a piece of metal being a sheet of BBs, like for a BB gun, as you put shape into something, that surface area, if we picture this being all BBs and it's the molecules of the metal, when you smash it with a hammer, you're stretching that area. So if you're using a shot bag and a mallet to stretch out your panels, you are stretching out those molecules and ballooning the panel. I would say that a balloon, in my mind, is the easiest way to think about it when it comes to shaping, different than forming. The difference between it, shaping, you're actually changing the molecular shape of the panel by smashing those BBs, so to speak. Versus if you're forming metal, you're only changing it in two directions and you're bending it, and you can bend it right back. Shape, you cannot just reverse easily. You have to shrink it or stretch it. So with that being said, we are going to start using all of these magnets. And obviously this is a lot bigger area than what we're going to really need. But you can see how if I have just one magnet at the top and one at the bottom, and I pull this down flat with the top of the roof, I have a nice wrinkle right here. So what we're going to do, the more magnets, the better when you're trying to lay this stuff out. And this is also why I feel like it's easier to use a thinner paper. It will fold easier. In this case, we're probably just going to cut it And then we have the ability to overlap it and tape it. When you're looking at this paper, that it doesn't really appear that there's a whole lot of shrinking that's going to happen. For a flat piece of paper to actually fold over pretty easily with just one cut, this is going to really streamline it. Where we have this loose bit up here, we need to pull this edge down, and we can see another shrink that needs to happen here. If you're asking yourself, where do you start with putting the magnets? I would say start with putting them up at the top and letting the paper flow down over. It depends on the shape of the car, but anything you're gonna do, if you can get a paper that's really thin and it's gonna fall, I've seen guys even use foil, because foil, you can form it and you can fold it in on itself and you can see exactly where those tucks are and make notes. You can also do the flexible shape pattern like Ray Chalene does, where you use tape to lay out all of these designs, and he has videos on that too. But there's pros and cons with all of that, because if you put tape over every bit of this, it's not going to tell you exactly where your shrinks need to be or where the areas need to be stretched. Obviously, anywhere that we're overlapping the paper, that's a shrink. Anywhere that the paper gets separated to flow over a shape, then that's where we're going to be stretching it. And we can notate that when we transfer this paper pattern onto our sheet metal. So as easy as this may sound, it's not quite as easy to make that panel lay in there exactly as you want. Now, why is it important that a panel lays onto the car exactly flat to where there's not having to push? I can remember a time, even when we were starting out, where I would get a panel close and we might use a hammer and lean in on it while we tack. But the problem is, if that panel is pushing outward anywhere and it's not relaxed in the state that it needs to be in, that as soon as you apply heat with the welder to it, it's going to cause a massive amount of warpage. And if you can make a panel fit really nice, the amount of warpage that you have is minimal, because depending on if you're MIG or TIG welding it, you can control your heat. If you're a proficient welder, you can control your heat to where you have minimal shrinkage and warpage from it. All you have to know is that we're going to spend the time showing you guys how we shape this panel to fit. And once we get it to fit, if you weld it and it warps, the area that you have to hammer and dolly is your weld seam. We have several videos on this that we've done with like the quarter panel patch video. So we're not going to weld this panel in for you guys. We're going to show you how to make a panel fit really nice and dial it in and understand the real differences between shaping something, forming something, and maybe why you might put a cut seam in a specific area. We are planning to put our weld seams outside of an area that we can get to. The reason that I'm doing this now while the panel is just screwed on is because I know that although this weld seam can be a lot smaller, I want to show you guys what options you have. Maybe you can get access down in here from inside the car, but maybe you can't because of the structure up higher. And if that's the case, you can get a hammer and dolly in down here, and because the panel is only screwed on, I can then clecos this panel in place when we get it done, scribe our marks, make our cuts, and then weld this out on one side. Take the panel off the car, I can remove all of my warpage off of the car with the hammer and dolly. At that point, I can put it back on. Now I'm only dealing with the warpage of one weld up in the top of the roof. Now, depending on where you put your weld seam, you might be outside of the structure or you might be behind the structure. And you might have to choose a different style welding to eliminate an extreme amount of warpage. So that is why I like to use paper patterning, because it's showing you exactly where you need to make your stretches, your shrinks. It's going to show you how the metal is going to flow over the panel. It's going to give you the surface area, and you can also make notes. If you have an inside edge that you want to tip down into a window, you can cut it right on the window and make notations that you need to add a 1/2 inch or whatever that may be. But understanding planning out your panel is the biggest thing. So use the paper to where it flows. And I can tell you that we've done a few of these, and the paper where you actually shrink it, sometimes it may change depending on where you put that shrink. But really all that matters is that wherever your paper is and you see it, how it lands and how it wants to fold down flat, that is going to give you a good representation of where you need to make your shrinks and stretches. So we're just going to tape a couple little areas so we can see. And you can see if it's several or if it's a big shrink to make a tight radius. In this case, it's very minimal. We only have 2 cut marks to get this to flow over. So now we can take and cut down our paper pattern into what we actually want to use for our surface area. I obviously don't want to make a big square panel, so I'm going to feel where my weld seam is, and if I push on it, it shows me exactly where the metal is that I need to fill. I'm going to go just outside, and I'm going to make all of my corners radiused corners. The reason that we do that is because when you are metal finishing out a weld seam, if you have one plane and another plane meeting in that joint, you are having 2 different amounts of heat in that weld instead of having a continuous weld. And when you're metal finishing it, those 2 planes are going to fight you. If you put a radius in all of your corners for all of your patches, it will fight you a lot less. Just going to move our magnets up. And now we can do our edge for our window. Although our paper pattern is going to be right on the edge cut, I would definitely leave yourself an inch or 2 extra, so that way in case you're just a tiny bit off, you're not having to patch in another piece of metal and you can get it to fit just right. Now obviously up here, our seam is not that big. It's just right here. But I want to come in and put a nice radius up here. Now that we have the paper pattern cut and we know where our shrinks are going to be, the next thing that I like to use, and the way that I was taught by Lazzy Metal Shaping, was to make a profile in the gauges. So you can use sweeps. Sweeps are just all of the different shapes that are used. Sweeps are not typically the most affordable thing unless you're doing a lot of shaping. However, there's an easy way to make your own gauges that Lazzy teaches. And he just cuts real thin. This is 1/2 inch 18 gauge sheet metal. And we can form this in to make a straight edge and then take a Sharpie. So that way we know we put the gauge in the same spot every time. And we're basically going to lay out a grid. You can even do this with cardboard. If you actually take cardboard, normal box type cardboard, not thin, something thicker and rigid, and you can actually take a soft block in 80 grit and you can sand that profile to fit this shape perfectly. What you want to do is have a few different areas within this grid of this shape that we can mark and label. So in this case, I'm going to label the first line A. I'm going to come in. All I'm using this one for is just to mark a straight line. So that way I'm putting it in the same spot every time. So be B and C. Now that we have the lines marked out for the radiuses of where they're going to be, we are going to make our radius gauges, which are going to act as sweeps. Sweeps are to define what shape of the car from one area to another and how they change. The sweep is basically the radius of that shape, and sweeps are in different lengths. But what we're going to do here is we're going to actually just make a gauge. This is a lot cheaper, a lot simpler, and it's pretty effective. And you can check this stuff over by your tooling of where we're going to shape it instead of having to come back and forth to the car. What this is essentially doing is, if you go into coach building and metal shaping, they would use a buck. And that buck is a wood template or metal template of a whole bunch of grids of that car, and they would put the panel onto the car to see if it's fitting flush against it. But in this case, if you put the panel onto the buck, a lot of times you can't see in every area that you need to see if it's fitting the panel where it needs to be. So if we do what I would call a reverse buck, these templates are essentially a reverse buck. You have points of reference, witness marks, that you can line them up every time on your panel, and you can check if you have too much shape or too much form and make adjustments until it fits these profiles exactly. We're going to make these profiles with a kick shrinker stretcher. You can use the cheap kick shrinker stretchers, and they even have hand operated shrinker stretchers that you can get at your local Harbor Freight if you guys wanted to. It will at least get you started with shaping, and you'll start to see that with very minimal tools what you could accomplish, and then it's just a matter of picking away at getting a little bit better tools. So we're going to take these, and they're straight. We're going to cut them, and we're just going to start moving this metal. So if we're using a kick shrinker or stretcher, we are going to just use it on the edge. And the best way that I would explain how they work is if you pictured a wedge and you were shoving a wedge onto one side only, not all the way through, if you add metal here and you stretch, it is going to expand one side longer and it is going to kick it one direction. If you subtract a wedge, it is going to make this line on this edge smaller and it is going to curve in. It's that simple. We are going to do it ever so slightly, because if you make one big move, it will curve it over really quick. You just want to have enough pressure that you do this gradually to make a nice curve, and you will need both shrinker and the stretcher, because I guarantee when you're starting out, you're going to overshrink or overstretch these pieces. We have the sweeps all formed on the kick shrinker and stretcher, and we've labeled them A, B, C, D. Now that we have that for each one, we will go over, transfer our paper onto our sheet metal, get it cut out, and start putting those shrinks that we had marked into the panel and lay it on so we can transfer these marks onto our sheet metal. You can put magnets along this entire perimeter, but this paper is pretty rigid that I'm using today, and we're gonna cut it bigger than what I actually need. Up here on the roof line doesn't need to be bigger because it's already longer, but the most important part is putting the marks in here for where the shrink needs to happen. Now that we have our shrink references, We are going to go over and just shear these out. We're going to leave it a little bit on the long side, maybe an inch, inch and a half around it. And then we'll go over to the shrinker and we will work these lines and start setting it on the car to see what kind of look we have. All right, we've got our panel cut out. Lift a little bit of excess where we needed it. We didn't need it up on the roof or by the window. And we're just going to come into the, this is a deep throat stretcher. So jet is not necessarily the nicest. It is more of the middle of the road quality wise. They work just fine. So if you're looking and you're in the market, what we're gonna do is put it in to the area and then work it out. We want to be consistent through all of this. Consistent shrinks to the edge. And what this is doing is grabbing the metal and gathering it, making it thicker in the middle. Now, because that paper pattern that we had was a lot thicker paper, we may have more of the wrinkles along the perimeter, but they're not going to be a big shrink. So at this point, we're just trying to get the initial shape going into the panel. And we're going to start with very little. The other thing we're going to do is we're just going to set this on the car and we're going to start bending it to the shape. So bending is forming it. You're not shaping it. Here, we're actually shrinking it and we're adding shape by doing that. By shrinking the perimeter, it's going to balloon the center area. And then at some point, we will actually take the radius of the roof with a profile gauge, and or we have a radius gauge with the needles that you can actually check the exact profile. We're going to take that profile from the roof and we are going to match it up with the lower anvil on the English wheel. So as we set the panel on here in the orientation that we want it, I'm just lining up this back triangle window here and I'm rolling the panel in till I can see my witness marks from my profile gauges, and I'm just adding a little line on either side that we can then connect the gauge, and I'm going to make a reference mark for that is profile D. I can roll it up and I can roll it down. You may have to wait till you get more into the shape before you can start adding these details. And it's just to get you close. But what I want to do is now we have some points of reference that this bends over. I rolled the panel on the car and put the witness marks on it. If your panel does not lay over it, or maybe there's a lot of shape in whatever it is you're making, you can put those same witness marks for these profile gauges on your paper pattern, so that way when you transfer it, you have a way to reference those when you start shaping. Now, this is another way to use a profile gauge, but the problem is it's only 6 inches long, and the problem with that is we need the entire profile. We need to be accurate all the way through as it changes. But the main shape, if I put this on the car and do a sanity check, the middle gauge we were able to use for both B and C. We just moved where the stop and starts are on the actual gauge. With checking the gauge to it, what we're going to do is we are going to match it up with the lower anvil on the English wheel, which is a very low crown. When you look at it, it almost looks flat, but you need to be matching it up with the profile that you have to what you're going to put into the panel. Now, there's a couple things that's going to go into this particular shape. We know with the profile that goes from front to back along the sail panel that it has a very, very little bit of shape, not form. Now the difference here, again, just to reiterate, that you can do shaping and forming with an English wheel. Shaping, you will be using metal on metal to the lower wheel and the upper wheel, and that is going to be displacing the metal. It's going to be smashing those, as I called it, the BBs, those molecules in the metal, the sheet metal. As you run it through, it's only contacting in the very center, stretching that metal out 360 degrees. But if you add the rubber band to the upper wheel, you are now forming. So say you want to build a transmission tunnel for your car, then you would be using a rubber band for the long straight tunnel. In this case, we are looking at the gauge. We can see that we have shape from front to back. If this was straight, then we would use the rubber band. But because we know we have a little bit of shape, we are going to be using metal on metal, matching the crown of the lower radius of the wheel to the profile of gauge that we made, and we are going to go in with light pressure. Now, maybe you don't have the budget for a nicer English wheel. This one is made by Lassie. Lassie doesn't make these wheels anymore. However, there's different tiers to the different English wheels. I always use Harbor Freight because a lot of you guys are in your garage and everybody's got a budget. And if you do have a budget, there are ways that you can modify the Harbor Freight English wheels to work for your advantage. The big thing there is that the rigidity of the English wheel, the C, the pressure is the big one, because if it's giving and it's not super rigid, it's not going to be as accurate. We had the Metal Ace English wheel a couple months ago, and I just sold it, and we bought this English wheel because this is what I learned on with Lassie in his class, and I learned how much better of a wheel this was. Now, the thing that I found that I liked was that the lower anvil does not have a T-handle to have to lock in, because here's the thing. If this is not floating solid and precise with the lower adjustment, when you have to crank in the T-handle on, like say a Metal Ace or some of the cheaper English wheels, you're locking that lower anvil and you cannot make a small adjustment. I don't want to say that you can't make a small adjustment, you just have to do an extra step. You have to release the T-handle on the lower that's holding this tight, make one small adjustment, and then crank that back down. It's not as easy to do the finesse from one shape to another, but you can definitely get it done. And the better that the polish is on the wheels, that's going to transfer directly into your part. So what we're going to do, we are going to put the sheet metal in here, and in the direction that we want to get this ever so slightly shape, we are going to work the panel from front to back until this matches. Another thing that's nice about these gauges is that you can set the gauge in the work area that you're in, and you don't have to constantly be going back and forth to the car. You can sit there and work this gauge. You can see what little bit that we actually have to add is very minimal. Now, why did I start with this one then rather start with the other way? Because the shape of the roof, when you put that little tiny bit of crown into this and the shape, we are going to be forming it back the other direction. And a lot of times you can even bend it around a post to get you close. But what we're going to do is put that little bit of shape in the center. And the way that we get that is, if you imagine having a picture frame, a border around this piece, and you're giving the surface area a ballooned effect. If you picture putting air into a balloon, you are stretching the surface area. That's exactly what you're doing with this. But if you overstretch the center and it becomes too high, and this is rocking in the middle, then you would go beyond your border to relieve the border and let the panel relax back out and grow. What that's going to do is it's going to release the center tension that you have, because if you have a border that is not being wheeled, then that center will grow upward in the direction of the lower anvil. So whether you're making a shape that's going in this direction, then you need to be having it riding over the lower anvil. If it's going to switch, then you will then flip the panel over and blend into one another. When I first started trying to figure out this, it wasn't really clicking until I took some classes on it, but as long as you are matching the lower anvil to the shape that you need and understanding shape versus form, shape you cannot just put it over your knee and bend it back. Form you can. So what we're gonna do is put it in there. You wanna make sure your panel's nice and clean. Make sure your anvils are nice and clean and not dusty, because all that's just going to transfer over. And what we're looking for here is we are looking for our witness marks longwise for the D profile that we made. It does not take much pressure. And a lot of times if you put too much pressure, you'll hear it ping. You want to work slowly into that shape. If you work with a lot of pressure from the lower anvil upward, you're going to see those beads, that pressure point, and it's going to feel like ripples into the panel. But if you just use light pressure and make lots of passes back and forth, that will gradually grow and you will creep in on the shape instead of balloon it out and then have to figure out how to go backwards. What you want to do when you are wheeling is push out, and when you come back to yourself, you're going to make a very small adjustment and then continue. So it's, as you move at the end, it's a very quick adjustment on one end. You can do it towards you, you can do it on the other end, you could do it on both ends. This feels awkward at first, but the more that you do it, the better it gets. And then you want the tracking marks to be as close as you can, so that way you are getting an even stretch. Now, wherever you start and stop, if you start and stop inconsistently, then you're going to have an inconsistent stretch. Wherever you start and stop, it gets run over more times, and those areas balloon up more than others. So what we're going to do to begin is we are going to go just to the ends, not running over the edge. And I'm doing it in the orientation of that gauge. And you can see, well, maybe you can see, it puts shape in the panel pretty quickly. So if we know this is the front, you can see we are almost already at the shape. We have a little bit more to do on the outer ends, but when we form this over, we're probably going to lose some of that shape. And you can see here, we've already got way more shape than we need. But the one thing that I will say is that when we actually form this over and you bend it, you are going to lose some of that, because as you push this down, the end comes up, and then we'll have to recheck it with the gauge. If we went, again, too far in the center, we will just wheel our border a little bit and it will bring it back down. Now that we have it bent around the bottom of this English wheel to kind of sort of get the shape going, or rather the form going, we're going to use these gauges. Now these gauges, because this gauge is the same radius from B to C, we just marked one on either side and we can check it. But because we have the same radius, it's not going in the shape. We've already put a little bit of shape in this panel front to back. What we want to do now is we want to form this panel over. And in order to do that, we are going to put the rubber upper wheel with the same crown that we need for that profile. And then we are going to wheel the panel back and forth through here and you will see how close this panel already starts taking shape. If you're asking yourself where you get a rubber band for the upper wheel, all that is off of an inner tube of a truck tire. You got to find out whatever upper wheel you have and then order a few rubber spare. It's the inner tube to a truck tire. And what it's doing now is you're forming. So the rubber band is got enough give in the center of this wheel, the contact point, that it's only going to be pushing the panel over. When you're using the rubber band, you want to do light pressure, because if you have heavy pressure, you'll end up walking the rubber band right off of the upper wheel. So all I'm going to do is just put a little bit of pressure on it, and I'm going to slowly work that through, all the way through the border, because we're trying to give this form all the way through it. Even though we bent it over the bottom, this will take out any of those creases. You don't have to bend it over. You could totally start with just the English wheel. And you can see it doesn't take but a couple passes to really start putting some bend in it. Now we can use our profile gauge. We got to go back to what is the top, and you can see we still have quite a bit to go. How do you know when you've maxed out that die? When you can actually sight through the bottom of the lower anvil and you have daylight at the ends of the anvil for the lower end, it's going to push it down till it makes complete contact. So just keep rolling it, and you'll notice that that air gap will slowly make full contact with that lower wheel. Although the center is the main point touching, by you going through there, you are forming it to that curvature, and then when it reaches the ends, you need to upgrade to the next radius if you need to. I don't recommend jumping to a very high crown, because it's going to put a whole bunch of lines. You want to gradually work the panel into the form that you want, or the shape that you want. Now what do we have longwise? You can see how before we were rocking, and because we put all of that form into it, now we need to bring it back in without the rubber band to put a little bit more shape from one end to the other. You'll end up losing some of the shape as you form it. It takes it from the edges. So what you have to do is do a little bit at a time and go back and forth and creep in on it. As you're wheeling, you want to keep the panel going straight and in line. So if you're doing a big panel, long panel, you're going to need two people, because if the panel starts to dip on one end, it will take way more shape to that lower anvil, and the panel will actually stay that way. So if you're trying to gain a lot of shape, something as simple as pulling down a little bit on the panel will also put a little bit more shape in the panel faster. So if you're wanting something that's low crown like what we're doing, keep the panel in line. And I'm coming up to these shrink areas that we had, kind of going around them, because I know that's still going to need to be shrunk. If you have a bunch of lines and it doesn't feel smooth, just ease up on your pressure and wash through everything as even as you can. And the more passes that you go through there, the more it will even out. We did very minimal shrinking in the very beginning, but now that we have the amount of shape in the panel from front to back, and we have the gauges fitting pretty close, we have periodically gone back to the car and checked it. And where we see that our edges are just a little bit too high, we need to come in and kind of bring in some shrink. Down here fit actually pretty good with even the little bit that we have in it. But right up here, we have just a little gap. And if you have a gap and you know you need to bring it down, it has too much surface area, we need to shrink it. So we're going to go around this perimeter up here with the kick shrinker, and that will bring it down. At that point, we will run back to the English wheel and we can smooth out any of those marks or where the jaws are actually doing individual shrinks one by one. We're going to go through this consistently. Same amount in, and then step it in. And what that's going to do is let it curve inward. At this point, our main goal here is to make sure that every edge that's contacting the adjoining panels is sitting completely flush and it's not being forced into place. If it's being forced, that's where you're going to get way more warpage. If it's relaxed, you're going to have little warpage to have to deal with. For this particular panel, we are now going to take this panel back off. We'll spray the blue Dicom layout fluid. We can place it back on, scribe nice and sharp. The Clecos are extremely nice because you can put it right back in the exact same spot every single time, and you can make that scribe mark, take the panel off and cut it and fit it. And we can fully weld this piece out off the car, metal finish the weld, and then put it back on to finish the top side. I hope this was enough little details. It's kind of an entry level for you guys if you're wanting to do some shrinking, stretching, English wheel, but just understanding where to pinpoint the shrink, the stretch, the form. Let the paper pattern tell you exactly what needs to happen. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we will see you guys on the next one.